Today's arguments are about the question of what happens if the mandate to buy health insurance or pay a penalty is struck down by the court. So that's a big if. We don't know whether the court will actually find that part of the law unconstitutional, but if it does, they have to answer the question of what happens next. What happens to the rest of the law? Now, and that's what they discussed for 90 minutes this morning.
Now, Peter, I was reading the Wall Street Journal blog, and I got the sense that the mandate is in big trouble here, the individual mandate. And so they were discussing what in legal terms is called the severability of the rest of the bill. I hope I'm getting that right. Am I right in interpreting the individual mandate as being in big trouble on the court?
I think it's definitely in trouble. Justice Kennedy seems to be the swing vote on the court, possibly Chief Justice Roberts. We're talking mainly about yesterday's arguments. And Justice Kennedy said some very skeptical things about the law in the first half of yesterday's arguments. And then towards the very end, with just a few minutes to go in the argument, he comes back with a very tough question for the law's challengers, suggesting that maybe you are engaging in healthcare commerce, even if you don't have health insurance.
Right.
So Justice Kennedy is very hard to read, but certainly it's a possibility that the justices would vote 5-4 to strike down the law.
Now, Peter, hang on one second. We're going to hear from Justice Kennedy. I believe this is from today's deliberations, where he was talking about the role of the individual and the state.
That the federal government has a duty to tell the individual citizen that it must act, and that is different from what we have in previous cases. Well, that changes the relationship of the federal government to the individual in a very fundamental way.
I mean, the main issue here, which is what the state can or cannot mandate or force the individual to do, Kennedy seems hung up on this point.
Right, that came from yesterday's argument.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, he was hung up on, as you say, on this point of what can the state force people to do, the government, the federal government. Can they make people carry health insurance if they don't want to? But the government argues in return, and this seemed to sink in a little bit with the justice, that you are engaging in commerce even if you are sitting on the street with no health insurance or nothing, no interest in health insurance,
now,
that even so you may ultimately get sick and need to go to the hospital.
Now, in today's deliberations, I think it was Justice Ginsburg who suggested that it should be up to, let's assume, again, let's take the assumption that the individual mandate is struck down. Then comes, what do you do with the rest of the bill? Justice Ginsburg suggested that you keep the rest of the bill and you basically let Congress figure it out.
That's exactly what she suggested, and that's pretty close to the government's position. The government says a few portions that are very intimately linked with the individual mandate should be struck, but the rest of the law can stand. However, overall, looking over the entire 90 minutes of today's arguments, the 5 conservatives, including Justice Kennedy, seem to say that if this one part falls, the whole law has to fall. They consistently were saying that it's so difficult to go through hundreds of pages and hundreds of provisions and figuring out which one should stay, which one should die. Better just to make a clean break of it and kill the whole thing. What
is most likely to happen here if, let's assume, again, this is an assumption, but if Justice Kennedy comes out and says, you know what, I'm not for the mandate, I'm against the mandate, is it most likely that they'll just strike down the mandate, or will they have to strike down the entire law?
Based on today's arguments, I would say the more probable outcome would be that they would strike down the entire law. However, there's another interesting way of looking at today's arguments, is in that Justice Kennedy seemed to recognize that the whole law is a mixture of intricately linked elements, and it's so difficult to untangle them. And so that may persuade him, I suppose, that perhaps the law needs to be upheld, because if you strike down part of it, you strike down all of it.
Well,
it's hard to determine where Justice Kennedy is going with that.
Well, the reality, as I understand it, in effect, the mandate is the financing mechanism for the rest of the bill. So if you take out the mandate, you basically take out the element that was going to pay for the whole thing. Am I getting that right?
That's right. The mandate brings in millions of new customers for insurers, and that gives them the financial wherewithal to offer coverage to all comers, which is another provision of the law. So clearly, that it is a key financing mechanism. However, there are other parts of this law that really have nothing to do with health insurance per se. I mean, there's things about black lung disease that the justices talked about. There's things about generic biologic drugs. A lot of provisions that really do seem severable from the mandate, but perhaps it's too difficult for the justices to tackle each line and try to go through each provision one by one.
Peter, I know it's we still have this afternoon session, which has to do with Medicaid, I believe, somewhat different. Do you think at the end of these 3 days we can summarize? Is the Obama White House feeling good about the last 3 days? Are they feeling pretty lousy? Or are they going to go, more or less what we expected?
Well, we spoke with a White House official after yesterday's argument, someone who was in the courtroom hearing Justice Kennedy, and this person did acknowledge that the White House felt it was a little bit tougher than they had expected. They knew it was going to be tough from some of the conservatives, but Justice Kennedy's pretty critical questioning in the first hour of Tuesday's arguments, and I would guess again today when he didn't seem to agree with the government on this severability question, I think it's a little bit tougher than the government expected. They still hope the law can be upheld, but they're not so sure anymore.